Hey everyone, I'm Chris. I serve as the lead pastor of Mill Creek Foursquare, and welcome to our podcast. This exists as an extension of the teaching ministry of our pastoral team. Here you're going to be able to find everything from Sunday messages to midweek communications, classes, interviews, conversations with friends. So we hope that you feel invited to participate in the life of our fellowship and receive of this ministry. Here you're going to be able to learn more about current events and much about the scriptures. So enjoy, relax, breathe, and ultimately may you be experiencing the presence of God. Our goal is to make disciples of Jesus who are experiencing his life, engaging in his presence, extending the gospel to their family, neighborhood, workplace, and world. So welcome and enjoy.
Welcome to episode number 4 in our Mill Creek Foursquare Church Midweek podcast. This is John, and I'm here with Trevor, one of the pastors on our staff and part of our teaching team. He and Chris have been doing most of the teaching so far through the book of Revelation, and this podcast is our way of providing an additional opportunity and an additional space for conversations around some of the theological themes within the book, some of the practical, pastoral, and even sort of discipleship-oriented implications of the book, and also some of the broader sort of interpretive questions that reading a complex and somewhat difficult book like Revelation tends to raise for us, not least in our complicated cultural situation.
Yeah, we basically just needed more time to talk about it because our sermons on Sundays weren't long enough as they are. So we're like, you know what? We need to cut this down and we'll start a podcast or something anyways.
Yeah. So our goal in this episode is to spend some time unpacking and discussing some of the major themes and some of the key terms that show up in the book. Some of the themes that we'll especially explore have to do with the language of conquering or overcoming, as well as related themes of faithful witness or just witness and endurance. These are themes and key terms that come up over and over in the book and that are closely related to one another. And one of the reasons that it can be helpful to spend some time discussing them and unpacking them is that so many terms that show up in our Bibles and show up in common Christian discourse can easily become cliche, can easily become words that we give affirmation to, and we might even sing about them in our worship songs, and they might become part of our sort of general outlook on things. And yet we don't always sort of grasp them with the full force of which they were sort of intended to communicate. And so if we think about a term like conquering or overcoming, not many of us would dispute that this is sort of a central component of our faith, that sort of in and through Christ we are overcomers or something like that. We sing about this, we might pray about this kind of thing.
Oh, we raise our hands in worship.
But to what extent has our understanding of what victory or conquering means, to what extent has that really been shaped by the biblical text and what it reveals for us?
Yeah.
Or we might use language, as Chris and Trevor both have throughout the Revelation series, we might use this language of faithful witness, and that's great, that's wonderful. It's a very appropriate sort of catch-all term for one of the central messages and invitations of the book. But what exactly do we mean by it? And what does it entail?
Well, I think, and that's the important defining your terms, right? Because especially seeing how the author is intending to use a word, right? Because many times, especially with Revelation, there are ways that John is picking up on this language within his cultural moment. He's picking up on this imagery. He's even, at times when we read the book, he's taking violent imagery, for example, and he subverts it, right? He takes words and he turns them upside down. He's taking things that people would have understood in his cultural moment. So, we're talking about conquering. It's a major theme we've been talking about on Sundays, right? It's a word that we've been tracing throughout the first part of the series, really, and kind of pulling on this strand as we walk through the book. And, it's the Greek word nikeo, and it is a word for victory, right? It's a word for military conquest. It's a word in John's day that denotes everything we would have thought of being an athletic competition, being a victorious one. And so in many ways, it's what the name Nike come from as well. I mean, the company Nike draws their name from this as well, from Greek culture. And so John is picking up on this strand in his cultural moment, yet we have to beg the question as we study throughout the book, how is he intending to use this imagery of conquering? What does it actually mean to be one who conquers? And we know in the very beginning now we're introduced this language in the very beginning of the book in the letter to the 7 churches, right? So we step into Revelation chapter 2, and we see that this language of conquering is from the very beginning. We see that in the letters to the 7 churches in chapters 2 and 3, one of those popularized sections of the book, that in every address to each church, we see the language of conquering being used as an invitation to each of these communities of faith. And so we see, to the church of Ephesus in Revelation 2:7, he says, "He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who conquers, I will grant to eat of the tree of life, which is the paradise of God." To Smyrna, where in verse 11, "He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death." Pergamum, he says in verse 17, "To the one who conquers, I'll give some of the hidden manna." Thyatira, we see in verse 26, "The one who conquers, now I'll give my works until the end. Him will give authority over the nations." I don't know if I should read all of these. Should I just keep going? But basically, to all of the 7 churches, they're given this invitation. And it's the invitation to be one who conquers, which actually, I mean, understand that we both would understand the historical context, but it would seem backwards in many ways to describe these communities of faith as conquerors in their cultural moments.
Yeah. Especially because there's some debate among scholars about the extent to which these communities would have been undergoing any kind of sort of systematic persecution, but certainly there's a degree of persecution and a degree of oppression that's taking place. For example, there's, as we've talked about before on the podcast, there's mention of at least one person who's been martyred in one of these communities, this Antipas figure. And certainly at the very least, there's some kind of local, at least a sort of presence of some kind of opposition or persecution that leads to this sense of these communities being somewhat sort of marginalized or having a certain kind of pressure placed on them.
Well, and right there, you have to stop there and think about that being persecuted, or maybe it's minority being persecuted, but they're a minority community as well. And I just think of the imagery of conquering, and what does it mean for John to take this victorious kind of like word of just taking over, militaristic word, and applying it to a religious minority. Call it a group of people who no way would the culture refer to them as conquerors, maybe in their cultural sense, yet John is calling them to something. And so we almost see right away the language of him subverting something within the book, of just inviting these. I think one thing to also point out as we go through the 7 churches is that when he invites them to conquer, all of them he gives a promise, an invitation to each of them. And all of the invitations to conquer, like to eat of the tree of life, for example, one all draw from Old Testament imagery. So they're steeped in the Old Testament literature, Hebrew Bibles we've already talked about. But also, they're also promises that come in at the end of the book. And so they're invitations that come in their fullness. For example, the eat of the tree of life, which we see in the end of the book, is the tree of life that is the healing for nations in Revelation 22. We see, for the Thyatira, to the one who conquers and keeps my works until the end, to him or she I will give authority over the nations, and he will rule with a rod of iron. And we see that this marginalized community is invited to be a conqueror, and that they're going to rule and reign with God, which we know takes place in the end of the book as well. And so there's this picture of these people being invited. Really, if we boil down conquering, I would say it's probably the invitation to be faithful, to be one who is faithful to the very end. Now, we know that this language is not just applied to the 7 churches, but it's picked up to describe Jesus as well. Now, in chapters 4 and 5, how do you see the language of conquering take place in chapters 4 and 5? And how does it really apply to Jesus?
Yeah, I think you used earlier the language or the concept that this notion or this terminology associated with conquering or having victory or overcoming is being picked up by John, but then used in a particular way, perhaps even in a kind of subversive way. So if in John's own context, if this terminology, this verb nikao, which might be used to describe some kind of conquest, some kind of victory, some kind of, overcoming some odds, if this would be normally used in categories associated with military victory or even victory in the context of an athletic competition or something like that, then we might expect a fairly sort of straightforward notion of conquering. So if these are minority religious communities within a sort of powerful Roman imperial context, then we might expect something like conquering to mean, oh, well, God's going to sort of win. He's going to become more powerful than the powerful, Roman
go take the throne.
Context. And then what it means to be the people of God means you get to sort of be on his right hand and his left hand when he does so, and you get to sort of be the important ones that sort of swoop in along with him and sort of take over by force. And yet, the book of Revelation participates very much in a pattern that we see throughout the New Testament, where what it actually means for God to conquer or overcome or achieve victory, to establish his kingdom, to reestablish his rule over against various entities that vie for control and power and these kinds of things, it consistently throughout the New Testament and here in the book of Revelation looks very different from what we might expect with our conventional notions of sort of power and might from a human perspective. And so the really striking portrait we get in Revelation 4 and 5 is this profound vision of a heavenly throne room. We've got this insistence of God being the one on the throne, God being the one in control of all things. But we still, as chapter 5 opens, we have this sort of question, and a question that is posed with a good degree of sort of distress on the part of John. We've got this awareness of a scroll that's there that needs to be opened in order to reveal or disclose something significant. And we have John weeping because no one is found worthy to open the scroll or to look into it, to reveal its contents. We have this sort of response from one of the elders in chapter 5 saying, "Do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered." He has done this nikao thing. Yeah. He's overcome, or he has achieved victory, and because of that, he's able to. He's gonna be the one who's worthy to and able to open this scroll and sort of move this narrative forward and disclose what needs to be disclosed. The crucial thing to recognize here is that the way that John subverts this language is not only through sort of using the language of conquering in a way that doesn't look much like conquering, but it's even through the imagery that he uses. Yeah. There's a number of points throughout the book of Revelation where John hears one thing, but then he turns and sees another. And the juxtaposition between these two things is what we're intended as hearers or readers to pick up on. And this is one of the most dramatic ones, where John hears something about this powerful image of someone who you would expect to conquer, to have victory, to overcome. Someone who's described as the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David. This is tied to all kinds of messianic expectations within the Hebrew Bible. And even just naturally, the imagery of sort of a lion as the king of the jungle. This is the kind of entity that one would expect to overcome and to be able to sort of take back power from any pretenders that have sort of tried to assume the throne or something like that. And yet what John turns and sees, in contrast to some extent to what he, or at least juxtaposed with what he hears, is a lamb standing as if it had been slaughtered. A lamb compared to a lion is not an especially sort of imposing figure. And this notion of a lamb being slaughtered, I mean, again, generally speaking, this is not a very promising image for sort of one who would be victorious.
Yeah, it doesn't take a cultural moment. It doesn't matter your cultural moment. It'd be fairly easy to resonate with that.
Right.
Yeah.
But then even especially when we sort of ground it within its Hebrew Bible context and its Jewish context, this would evoke images of specific animals that have become victims of this of these sort of sacrificial practices. And one of the last things that one would sort of associate this image of a kind of lamb that's throat has been cut, one of the last things one would sort of associate with that is somehow achieving some kind of dramatic victory or that kind of thing. And so there's a sense in which, and yet there's a profound truth here that on the one hand, as much as we humans might sort of expect or want Jesus to sort of show up as a victorious conqueror who kind of takes the world by storm and operates in more conventional forms of power and might and even violence over against his enemies or our enemies, over and over and over again in our scriptures, we see God refusing to sort of operate that way and revealing a different way that he accomplishes redemption in the world. We don't need, it's not only Revelation that gives us this juxtaposition, right? We have this juxtaposition of the sort of perhaps expectation of a conquering lion, but then the revelation of a slaughtered lamb, which is how Jesus actually accomplishes redemption and salvation. It should remind us of places like Philippians 2, where Paul talks about how Jesus did not just sort of grasp for or try to exploit what it would mean to be God and just take everything by storm, but actually humbled himself, embraced this sort of humble position of a human. It should remind us of the language in the Gospel of Mark, of Jesus coming not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And we should be able to sort of juxtapose it with the continual misunderstandings
the disciples.
Of folks who would seek to follow Jesus, who still want to insist that, but at some point conquering is going to look a little bit more like we expect, right? At some point we get to ride in on your right and your left and sort of actually take everything over.
Well, and it's funny how that expectation, which I know they were kind of coming with the Hebrew mind, the Hebrew Bible, and they were kind of drawing their expectation from certain texts, whatever else. But I feel like that resonates with us as a people in every generation of followers of Jesus, because there is that tendency to want to grab hold of that picture because I wouldn't say it's easier, but it feels like the way the world, in the sense the world works, that we're used to, right? In the sense of every generation, empires rise and fall, and how, in every generation, how this takes place. It feels like it's the way of the world, if that makes sense. And so it does feel countercultural to us. It challenges our expectations. And I would say it probably challenges every generation of followers in maybe in different ways, but in a similar way as well.
Yeah.
And I think it does challenge, guys, when I think about later in the book as well, that picture of how Jesus conquered becomes a template also for how we conquer. And I think that challenges us. Like I think of Revelation chapter 11, we trace this. I preached a sermon on it a few weeks ago, and it challenged me the whole time I was studying it. But Revelation chapter 11, we see the two witnesses, which we've talked about are symbolic pictures of the church. They're symbolic pictures of the church itself, as the two witnesses are the olive trees, which are the lampstands in Revelation chapter 11, verse 4. And John in Revelation chapter 1, verse 20, told us the lampstands are the church. They represent the 7 historical communities of faith, but 7 and also a sense of completeness, of wholeness for the church from generation to generation, the church universal. But we see the church in verse 7, we're told this, and it says, and when they have, of chapter 11, and when they have finished their testimony, the beast that arises from the bottomless pit will make war on them and conquer them and kill them. And so we see that the church is conquered, is literally conquered. And that one took me a while to, I think it challenges many of our expectation. And maybe that's also my vantage point as a 21st century Westerner or American as well, who has lived in this unique phase of human history where we haven't been actively persecuted in the sense of how the church has throughout history, or even the global family of the church as well. And so I think in many ways we've missed this picture, but it is the picture of us being conquerors. And it shouldn't be, I guess, that challenging to our expectation, though, when we think of Jesus, when we think of the template of Jesus and how Jesus conquered not by being the lamb or being the lion who is the lamb, that it sets a template for us as well. I guess we see that in chapter 12 as well, when we see the imagery of the dragon and this cosmic tension between good and even evil. And we see this in chapter 12, verse 11, which is one of the few verses that most people would probably quote in the book of Revelation, is, and they have conquered, speaking of the church, the people of God, and they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they loved their lives not even unto death. And so again, we see that the way the people of God conquer, they're invited into this invitation to be a conqueror, is by the blood of the Lamb. And I would say is in the way of the Lamb ultimately, is that picture that subverts. And it comes down to even that point of they love their lives, not even to death. And so there's this picture of not holding on. There's this picture of letting go. There's this picture that death is not the end of the story. And we're invited into a different posture in the midst of our culture, in the midst of our cultural moment. And ultimately, I guess success looks different. Success is defined differently. You know, this quote I had heard from, or Michael Gorman in his book, Reading Revelation Responsibly, he speaks of this and he says, but their success is measured not by the quantity of their converts, but by the steadfastness of their testimony. This suggests that the church should be missional and prophetic, I guess is a heavy word, but a martyrological community, a gathering of witnesses. And so again, I think that challenges that our own expectation of what it means to conquer, to be a conqueror. And it brings us to the end of the book as well. And so let me finish this loop and then we can talk more of the applications as well. But if we go to the very end of the book, chapter 21, in this picture of the end of the book of the new heavens and new earth, we know this to be a picture not of the people of us escaping the world, but a picture of God bringing heaven to earth. It's very much so challenges maybe some of our common cultural assumptions about the book, like we talked about last week. And we see in chapter 21, verse 7, this invitation once again, at the one who conquers will have this heritage, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. And so if we think about it, I just always imagine these historical communities of faith, that they get this text, they have revelation, it's being read in the public reading of scripture or something, and they've been listening to the book. And they remember at the beginning of the book, the invitation from Pastor Jon to be one who conquers. And they've made it all the way through the book, and they see the trials and tribulations and the tests. But then finally they get to the very end, the kind of the precipice of the culmination of the entire story of Scripture, the entire story of human history. And they see the heavens coming to earth. And once again, they hear this invitation to be one who conquers, right? To be one who is faithful to the very end. And what do you think that would have, as you hear that invitation, what do you think that would have meant to them as they heard it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think I think certainly there's a sense in which probably part of what Jon is doing is drawing people into the kind of message that sort of confronts one's sensibilities, right? Because it would be in a context in which you are at the very least, a sort of marginal community, and perhaps to some extent even a persecuted or oppressed community, even at a local level. There's a sense in which you couldn't help but associate this language of conquest with a desire for conquest, not wanting to be a community that sort of is under the influence or the power of this sort of powerful empire. And perhaps if they are experiencing overt forms of oppression and persecution, certainly wanting to be sort of liberated or set free from those kinds of constraints and even elements of suffering. And so I think there's something really powerful going on and something deeply pastoral in that Jon is not just, he doesn't just say, oh, it's not really about conquering, it's a different way. He's using the language that would evoke some of these sort of deep desires that we as humans tend to have to kind of fight back against something, or to sort of win, or to be the one who achieves victory, or to somehow sort of take things back for oneself or for one's community. It uses that language and it draws upon that imagery, but then as we've been talking about, it subverts it. And it insists over and over again that the way Jesus conquers is not through conventional expectations, is not the same as what the kingdoms of this world do, but in fact inverts it and sort of destroys sin, death, and evil from the inside out, as it were, with this sort of upside down kingdom that breaks into our present age. And then it insists too that then what it means to follow this Jesus is that we conquer in the same way, not by just sort of taking control on our own terms, not by sort of praying for and inviting and asking God to just sort of come in and destroy everybody the way that we might want to see happen, but rather through our confidence, our trust, our faith in the blood of the Lamb, our testimony, our sort of witness to who he is and what he's done for us, and ultimately our faithfulness as his covenant people, as God's covenant partners. I think one of the really interesting things, if we sort of bring it full circle and go back to the messages to the 7 churches in chapters 2 and 3, it's a little bit strange that there's no direct object for this verb associated with conquering. If we're talking about conquering or achieving victory, we might expect, okay, over what or whom? Right? Like, what exactly are we conquering? What exactly is going on
what are we winning here?
And if we think through sort of the messages to the 7 churches and how they might unpack for us, like what exactly is this conquering all about? It's helpful to note that there are at least 2 different strands to what it means to conquer, because these churches are promised something if they sort of if they demonstrate this kind of patient endurance and faithful witness in the sense of remaining faithful as those who sort of bear witness to Jesus and to Jesus' gospel, then there's this promise of these sort of rewards. So conquering has to do with sort of patient endurance in a sort of positive sense, but then there's also a kind of negative aspect, right? Because part of what it means for these communities to conquer or to overcome is to resist these various temptations to compromise and complacency that are also addressed in the messages to the 7 churches. And so I think ultimately what it means to conquer, according to the book, has both this sort of positive connotation of maintaining faithfulness, but also this kind of warning against potential elements of compromise that sort of corrupt or distort that witness.
Yeah, so it almost calls out and challenges something.
Yeah.
And I guess that would probably depend on your vantage point in the sense of, I think of with the 7 churches, I believe it's only 5 out of the 7 are corrected in heavy ways, but only 2 are not, in the sense, given a commendation of their actions. And those are the ones that we know to have some sense of persecution that they're taking place, that they are sensing some sort of active persecution or something. And so I guess it does, in many ways, that invitation to conquering does challenge, or in some ways it comforts, depending on your vantage point as... Yeah,
exactly. It's the language we talked about in the last episode of sort of comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable that can be helpful here. And it's not as if sort of everybody has to be one or the other. Like it can do both, right? One can be comforted by a book like Revelation in the midst of chaos, maybe like we are right now. Like we're in the middle of, something like COVID-19 produces a lot of anxiety for people in a lot of different ways and for a lot of different reasons, right? And there's legitimacy to that, right? Like the world can feel like it's been turned upside down. Yeah. And so it's legitimate, and it can be really helpful to remind ourselves that part of what this book is designed to do is to bring about comfort and assurance and invite and provoke a kind of faithful endurance as we remind ourselves that God is truly on the throne, that God is truly sovereign and is truly in control. And as we sort of recommit ourselves to trust him regardless of what may come, rather than sort of trusting in ourselves. So there's this sort of element in which this book really can be a source of sort of comfort in the midst of affliction for us. And yet, even in that, there's still this reality that we live in one of the sort of wealthiest, most powerful sort of contexts in the world today. We have many sort of privileges and advantages and all sorts of things. And there are, if we're honest with ourselves, there are all sorts of ways that our faithful witness to Jesus and his gospel and his upside down kingdom that sort of inverts the ways of this world and doesn't sort of grasp for power and dominance and control, but instead lays down one's life for
well, John,
for
we
others.
Can't jump to us. This is for people back in the day. Well, let's ask that question though. So what is it, in what ways does this invitation to conquer as 21st century Westerners or Americans, in what ways, I mean, you're Canadian, so we can include all of North America here, but in what ways does this invitation to conquer, as we've seen in Revelation, comfort us as 21st century kind of Westerners? And what ways does it challenge us? Which ways do you see that language, applying, and even in the church?
Yeah, I mean, I think it brings comfort and a genuine confidence that can be understood in contrast to the various other things that we are tempted to place our confidence in.
Yeah.
And so in the midst of, we're in the middle still of this prolonged pandemic, and it's global, and we don't know when it's going to end or when things will go back to normal, or if it's even wise to talk about things going back to normal, if there will ever be something like what normal used to be. Mm-hmm. And we're in the lead up to a historic election where really there's this polarized political and social climate in which many people are sort of dug in on one side or the other and feel like the implications of what's going to happen in November are going to be drastic, cosmic, maybe even apocalyptic.
Well, this episode should come out after that fact, but it will probably, all of those things will probably still be true.
Yeah, but I think that what a book like Revelation does is, in the middle of a scenario culturally and historically that feels that way for us, is it brings about a potential sort of comfort and assurance for us that we don't need to, and in fact it would be unwise and kind of ridiculous to place all our confidence in this particular political solution or this particular political figure or this particular political party. And even alongside that, it would be unwise and not in keeping with what we say we believe as Christians to place all our confidence in something like the economy of the United States of America, which is under threat. One might think both from the pandemic and some people might think from sort of certain political, values and policies and that kind of thing. It reminds us again of who is truly on the throne, who is truly sort of at the helm of human history and guiding all things toward their intended purpose. And so it can bring a sort of sense of comfort in the midst of that. But I think along the very same lines, it is a stark, it can function as a stark sort of critique for the subtle ways in which we've perhaps already allowed ourselves to become folks who maybe worship some of those other things in place of the one that we claim or sing on Sunday mornings to worship. It sort of exposes for us or unveils for us the true nature of some of the things that we place in the sort of ultimate or place in a position of sort of ultimate desire. It can reveal or unveil for us those ways in which perhaps our lives are oriented more toward something like wealth or security or political power or success. And it can unveil those things as much as we like to tell ourselves, well, those things are fine, at least in moderation, right? Or like, a good economy is important. Having a good retirement plan is wise and helpful. Like all of these things are fine in their own way. But a book like Revelation, the reason that it sort of unveils or discloses things is because we're really good at sort of self-justification, and we're really good at subtly compromising our faithful and exclusive allegiance to God and our faithful witness to Jesus. We're really good at compromising those things, but then making justifications for it. And compromising those things, but then sort of sweeping it under the rug. And a book like Revelation won't allow that. It uses this striking imagery and this sort of forceful language to sort of call those things out, expose the destructive nature of human power for what it truly is. Unveil the ways in which a lust for wealth or power or security actually reveals a kind of sinister idolatry and is often perpetuated at the expense of other people, resulting in injustice. And so I think in those ways, it invites us to both reaffirm our confidence in who God is and our allegiance to him in a sort of positive way, but it also has this sort of unflinching critique of the ways that perhaps we have already allowed ourselves to become compromised, and it invites us back into this pattern of repentance and recommitment to the way of the Lamb rather than our own versions of what it might mean to conquer.
Well, that's good. Amen and amen. I would just say, to reiterate, what you're saying, right, is I think in many ways you're hitting on how it subverts, the whole vision, but it subverts the how, I think, in many ways for many people too, of like how we actually come to be one who is victorious, how we actually become to one who is conquering. And you're hitting on how the world, we tie our identity, our value, all these things to all of these different arenas that we almost we anchor ourselves down to for a place of security. We anchor ourselves down to for a place of value or identity, whatever it may be. Yet in 2020, for example, I mean, we're seeing all of these things being in dramatic upheaval, and we're re-invited, as you're hitting on, that picture of the way of the Lamb and how we actually become one who is victorious. And what I love about it is that it's a picture that can be we can be invited into in every moment. Like, it's not just like when we're on top, right? When we get on top, we're the ones who are victorious or something. But it's actually a posture that any people in any culture we can be invited into, no matter if we're the minority or the majority. And I guess if whether we're the minority or the majority is where it comes into whether we're comforted or whether we're the ones who are actually critiqued in the middle of that too. Yeah.
Along those lines, one of the really striking quotes, and I actually wish I had it in front of me, but I wasn't thinking we'd talk about this in this episode, but I'm just going to anyway. There's a biblical scholar, a New Testament scholar named Richard Hayes, who's done a lot of really important and really helpful work. He has a really incredible quote that I have found quite helpful in sort of thinking about not only how to rightly and responsibly read a book like Revelation, but also trying to grapple with why so many sort of weird and sometimes unhelpful modes of interpretation tend to get attached to this book. One of the things that he suggests is that because an apocalyptic text like Revelation was written in the midst of at least some measure of persecution and oppression, and from the vantage point of people who are somewhat sort of marginal or even marginalized within a larger sort of dominant culture, there's a sense in which unless we learn to read it with those kinds of eyes, unless we learn to read it from the perspective of people who really need some kind of good news, who really need some kind of apocalypse in the midst of difficult situations, it's almost inevitable that we will come to distort it. And so one of the things that he suggests that I think is at least worth thinking about, if not just hitting the nail on the head, is that perhaps it's no accident that within a relatively wealthy and comfortable context like Western sort of contemporary North America, perhaps it's no accident that the ways we have sometimes tended to read the book have to do with sort of far-fetched eschatological speculation and these things that really have sort of no bearing on the concrete, practical ways in which we are called to bear witness to the gospel here and now. Because if we're not if we're in a situation, a cultural, historical, political situation that involves a high degree of sort of comfort and security, then there's a sense in which we don't need to be comforted by a book like Revelation, and we don't want to be critiqued by a book like Revelation. And so we will potentially find ways of making ourselves immune to what the book is actually trying to do. And instead we'll come up with all kinds of theories about how, which images in the book apply to Apache helicopters or things happening in the Middle East or these kinds of things, partly because we're reading it just based on our own assumptions and reading those into it, but also because I think in maybe subtle but really powerful ways, we're finding ways of avoiding the actual call to discipleship and the actual call to genuine faith and faithful witness that the book is drawing us into. And we're sort of replacing it with these sort of far-fetched things. And so his suggestion is if we read the book alongside and with and informed by people who are actually experiencing potentially analogous forms of suffering, persecution, oppression, marginalization, and exploitation, we might actually learn to read it better and more rightly and in accordance with what it was ultimately designed to do.
Well, when you read interpretations of marginalized communities and how they interpret the book, it seems is very distinct from the way that maybe a 21st century American, in some popularized approach, it's not necessarily scholarship as much, but at least some of the popularized approaches of Revelation, it stands very much so in contrast. I mean, I even see this. I was reading different things around our global family, for example, in Asia and China, who went through much persecution. And one Chinese pastor, I was reading it from one scholar, and he was talking and dialoguing, and he literally said, before persecution broke out, whatever else, he had said, they went through persecution, everything else, and finally the country kind of began to open up more or whatever else. And he literally said that, and he spoke kind of broadly of 21st century, maybe that very futuristic view of the book. He basically said, you lied to us. And he said, specifically about the rapture as well, he had said, you lied to us, and we just don't believe you anymore. And it was a dismissal in many ways of some of the popularized approaches we've taken in a Western context, because they went through persecution, they went through the Middle East, and they actually saw the earthiness of this book, that it actually was something that called something within them, not to get them out of the trials and tribulations, not to get them out of the world, but to actually call them to faithful witness in the midst of it. And I think that ultimately brings us to the invitation to conquer as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really important and powerful kind of practical example of precisely how this can help us. Is if we sort of gravitate toward these unhelpful kinds of approaches, perhaps due to the comfort and privilege of our particular cultural and historical situation, maybe learning to read the book alongside other communities, people with different perspectives and experiences and backgrounds, can actually help us to read it more faithfully and then respond to it perhaps the way that the book was intended to be read and then responded to. Well, thanks for listening to this episode. We've been primarily focused on trying to sort of unpack and discuss some of the specific aspects, but also some of the implications of this sort of central theme of what it means to conquer according to the book of Revelation, both in terms of how ultimately Jesus Christ has conquered, but then how those who follow Jesus, those who follow the Lamb, are invited to conquer according to the same pattern, according to the same way of Jesus. This episode has been edited by Tim Machira. It was produced by Dave Sproul, and we have music from Sherry Machira.
Thank you for joining us, and should you want more information or to engage with us further, please go to mc4s.org for more.